Welcome to another edition of the CS Podcast, where you can hear interviews with special guests such as
Dale Buchanan, Tom Waddle, Pierre Desir, Brent Berry, Ed Werder,
and many others.
Too big, too strong, too fast, too good.
So be sure to subscribe and tune in to the CS Podcast on YouTube at youtube.com/ChristianRE722.
Did you not get the memo?
That's www.youtube.com/ChristianRE722 for great interviews. Be sure to check out the CS Podcast.
You are ridiculous.
Welcome back to the CS Podcast. I'm your host, Chris Shanafel, and I'm now joined by 2015 NFL Draft prospect, defensive end out of the University of Nevada, Brock Hekking. Brock, I appreciate you taking some time to chat today, man. It's been a while since we last spoke. How's everything going?
Yeah, everything's going good, man. I appreciate having me out here, and it's good to hear from you.
Absolutely, man. It's the pleasure's all mine. So let's go ahead and get right to it. I just want our audience to, kind of get to know you a little bit, and I'm going to start this interview off by asking you a pretty simple question, and that is, coming out of high school, I know you're from California. Why did you decide to attend the University of Nevada and play football for the Wolfpack?
To be honest, I wasn't a really highly recruited kid at all. The Wolfpack was one of a couple offers that I had. I took my visit up there. I fell in love with the defensive line coach up there, Barry Sachs. I loved his intensity, the way he had a passion for the game, the way he coached. And, the rest is history. Committed on my visit and, blessed to be able to attend there.
You ended up redshirting your first year at Nevada, and then as a redshirt freshman in 2011, you seen playing time in just about every game as a reserve defensive lineman. And it was in 2012 when you became one of the team's starting defensive ends. You had a huge breakout year. You recorded 75 tackles, 2 forced fumbles, and even led the team with 10 tackles for loss and 8 sacks. Entering that season, what was your reaction when you found out that you would be a starter on that defensive line? And when you got the opportunity to start, how were you able to have the instant success that you were able to have that season as a redshirt sophomore?
It was just putting in all that work. I've been missing the game a lot. Redshirting was something that was difficult for me, but, it's a blessing in disguise. Just not being able to play the game to, just work out constantly was really hard. It makes you get that itch. You want to get out there. You want to play on Saturdays and, do your best. And so, that redshirt year coming out of that, I shared time with a senior, but, that was just kind of a season for me to get, basically my feet under me, get used to the tempo of college football. And until that sophomore year, I was 100% prepared. And, so I just came out and, I played as hard as I could, and, the rest is history.
And, of course, that redshirt sophomore year of yours, that 2012 season, that actually ended up being head coach Chris Alt's final year coaching the Pack. He, of course, spent over 40 years there as a player and a coach. Brian Polian, son of now Pro Football Hall of Famer Bill Polian, ended up being the team's next head coach. And I got to say, he's really done a great job over the last couple of seasons. Definitely a guy I'm a fan of. But what was your reaction when you first found out that Alt wouldn't be your head coach any longer? And with the new coaching staff coming in, were you ever afraid that you may not fit into their system and that transferring to another school may be the next step for you? Did that ever cross your mind at all?
Well, first, when Coach Alt announced his retirement, I was sad. He was a guy who is the face of the program up there, but, he put in his time, he paid his dues, and, I was just blessed to be able to play under him. When I first found out that Brian Polian was going to be our head coach, I was excited. I was familiar with the name. And so it was one of those things where I wasn't really nervous about, whether or not I'd fit in the system and all that nonsense. I was just excited to play for him and see what he had to, to bring to the table.
And, of course, looking back, it seems as if you fit into that system just perfectly. As a junior in 2013, Brock, you showed that 2012 season wasn't just a fluke and that you were one of the top players in the conference. You started all 12 games, recorded 48 tackles, 14 and a half tackles for loss, 9 sacks, and you recorded your first and only interception of your college football career. I believe it was against Hawaii, if I'm not mistaken. With all that being said, and with your name beginning to buzz, what were your expectations for this past season, knowing that it'll be your final go-around at the college level?
Going into my senior season, I wanted to make it about the team as much as possible. You know, these are the seniors in that class. You know, we had something special together. You know, we had been through a lot, you know, redshirting together, going through numerous coaching changes, you know, some tough loss in the season before. So, you know, I was willing to do whatever it takes to, you know, ensure that we won a Mountain West title. Unfortunately, you know, that's not the way that it went. But, you know, I had some great memories with those guys and, you know, made some friends that, you know, I'll keep forever.
Well, Brock, it was another very solid season for both yourself and the Nevada football team as a whole. You guys were able to finish the regular season 7-5 and meet Louisiana Lafayette in the New Orleans Bowl, where unfortunately you guys fell short 16-3. You were able to track down the quarterback for a sack in that bowl game and finish the season with 56 tackles, 10 tackles for loss, 5.5 sacks, and a recovered fumble. Looking back at the last 4 or 5 years, how would you describe not only this past season, but your overall experience at the University of Nevada playing for the Wolfpack?
You know, first, it's just a blessing, man. I had a great time there. Met a lot of great people. You know, I was fortunate enough that, you know, I graduated, got my degree, and then I was able to pursue an NFL career. You know, we had a lot of ups and downs there, but overall, I think, you know, everyone that's gone through that program knows that, you know, that program teaches you mental toughness and how to play the game right and how to be a good person. And so that's what I took away from my time there.
Chris Shanafelt talking with 2015 NFL draft prospect Brock Hekking out of Nevada. Now, when I say 2015 NFL draft prospect, Brock, what goes through your mind? I got to think that the NFL has always been a dream, but when you committed to the University of Nevada coming out of high school, did you ever think that eventually you would be getting ready to play in the NFL?
No, I didn't. You know, when I first got into the University of Nevada, my plan was to go to dental school. I was a biology major, and, you know, I focused on school and, you know, football, but school always came first. And then once I started, you know, playing a little bit better and kind of figured out that, hey, I might have the shot, you know, at this whole next level thing, you know, I devoted myself to football as much as possible.
And, of course, being at the University of Nevada, Brock, you've been able to play against some of the best talent in the country. If you had to single out one, who would you say is the best or most impressive player you've had to play against? I mean, is there anybody specific that sticks out?
Sure. I mean, there's a handful of people. Ty Sombrillo out of Colorado State is doing extremely well. You know, left tackle, plays the game great. You know what? But honestly, the best competition that I've had was at the University of Nevada, and that was going against Joel Bitonio, who's now, you know, playing for the Browns now. But, you know, being able to go against him every day and practice against him, and then to see what he's done in the NFL and how he's excelled is, you know, that's hands down just amazing. And, you know, he's the best player that I've played against.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, but Bitonio absolutely left his mark at the University of Nevada. Was a second-round pick for the Browns last year. Some would argue that he should have been a first-rounder, and you know, some others would even argue that he should have been a Pro Bowler last year. I mean, he really did have a great year for the Cleveland Browns last year. Moving on, what would you say is the biggest or most memorable play that you've made throughout your college football career at Nevada?
You know, the entire game versus Hawaii my junior year was one of the most impressive games, you know, for me. You know, I had a bunch of sacks. I had my first interception, had a couple forced fumbles, and, you know, that was a great one. But, you know, beating UNLV and getting the Cannon back this year, that was also a pretty memorable, you know, game. But, you know, there's something about your first sack in college that you never forget. And that was, you know, that first game that I started in 2012 against, you know, University of California. And, you know, we were big underdogs. And we went down there and we opened up against them and we beat them at their house. And I recorded my first sack. And so I think that's my most memorable moment.
Okay, yeah, it definitely sounds like it doesn't get too much better than that. Not only winning the game as, you know, going in as underdogs against Cal, and then, you know, being a defensive lineman, getting your first quarterback sack, like you said, man, that's something you almost dream about. Now, obviously, there's a ton of guys from the University of Nevada that have made it to the NFL. I mean, off the top of my head, you got linebacker Brandon Marshall, you mentioned Joel Bitonio, and, of course, Colin Kaepernick. I know there's many more, but is there any chance that you've been able to speak to anybody, whether it's any of those guys or not, that has had any type of experience at the next level, and have they given you any advice as to what to expect during this draft process?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I still keep in contact with Joel Bitonio a lot. I've talked to Kaepernick here and there. Talked to Virgil Green here and there, and as well as Brandon Marshall and James Michael Johnson. And, they've just kind of been there for me throughout this process. The first time I reached out to them for help was, when I was choosing my agent. And, how to go about that process. And then, actually talked to Cap the other week. He's down here in Arizona with me. And, we were just talking about training camp and, what to expect and, pro day and basically how to get your mind right before all then and what to expect.
Hey, that sounds great. Once again, Chris Schanfeld talking with 2015 NFL Draft Prospect, defensive end out of the University of Nevada, Brock Hekking here on the CS Podcast. And Brock, just a few more questions, then I'll let you go. I really do appreciate your time. Over the last 4 years, you've obviously been a huge part of that Wolfpack defense. I see on ESPN they have you listed at 6'4", 255. As you get ready to play at the next level, has the thought of playing outside linebacker come to mind at all? I mean, what do you think about that?
Absolutely, and before we had the coaching change, I kind of played that, hybrid outside linebacker in a 3-4, and so we ran that about 50% of the time. The other 50% we were 4-3, and I put my hand in the dirt. But I love standing up, and being that I am kind of an undersized defensive end, but I'm a pass rush specialist. That coming in as an outside linebacker and rushing the edge is something that I'm 100% confident in and prepared for.
And what do you feel is your biggest strength as, whether it's a defensive end, outside linebacker, or a football player in general? Is it those pass rushing skills that you mentioned?
Yeah, first is my pass rushing skills. Second is just my motor. My relentlessness on the field is something that I take pride in. I never take a play off, and I feel like that, if you watch my film, it shows that.
Is there anybody currently playing in the NFL that you might compare your game to?
Absolutely. I think it's a combination of, Clay Matthews and Jared Allen. Clay Matthews for his technique. He's a technician out there. And, he's got a great motor, too. And Jared Allen just for his relentlessness and how he plays the game. The guy loves football, and you can see how, by his play, how much he cares and, how much he enjoys the game. And that's something, that I like to show, too, is, some people take this game too seriously. And, after all, it's a game, and I feel like, people need to remember that. We got to have fun out there, man.
Well, hey, man. You just named two of the best defensive players that are playing today, so you certainly cannot go wrong with that. Now, Brock, let's say there's an NFL general manager listening to this very interview. Why should he want you a part of his team?
First and foremost is my versatility as a football player. I'm going to work hard, do whatever I can to make the team, but, I can offer, my skills in various positions. I can play about any special teams you put me on. Kickoff is probably one of my favorite things ever, man. There's nothing like a rush running down on kickoff. But, it's also, I can, rush the passer. And so when you have a guy who can, fill a role on special teams and excel in that, and then also a guy who can come in on third down or, whatever situation may be, that can come in and put pressure on the quarterback, I think that's pretty valuable.
Yeah, absolutely. Especially, like you said, having a guy that doesn't mind playing special teams. I mean, that right there says a lot if you ask me. Now, I know that back in January you were able to participate in the NFLPA Bowl, a college all-star game for some of the top prospects in the country. Can you just tell us about that experience and what it was like to go up against some of the best in the nation?
Yeah, first, before that game, I actually played in the Medal of Honor Bowl out in Charleston,
That's right.
South Carolina.
Mm-hmm.
So I played in that, and that was truly an amazing experience. Not just the game and the level of competition, but everything else that game brought. To speak with, some of our nation's heroes and, just to listen to their stories and stuff was something, truly amazing. And then, so I actually got invited to that NFLPA game about, 3 or 4 days into that. And, it's a tough week of practice, get after it every day. Every day is game day out there. You got to do your best in front of the scouts. And so, I flew from, Charleston over to L.A. and then, just started the week over again. And, there's a little bit better level of competition out there. But, it was good. It's fun to see how you match up against some of these other schools that you've never gone against and, talk to, similar guys in your position going through this process and what their thoughts are. And, it's the best part about it, honestly, is just picking the brains of the coaches that are there and, all the information that they have to offer us, it's great.
It's been quite a while since you've strapped up for the Wolfpack, but you mentioned those two college all-star games. Has it sunk in yet that you've played in your final college football game, and that the next time you play will be in the pros?
A little bit, yeah. As all my brothers in Nevada are going through spring ball and all that stuff right there now. I still keep in contact with all of them, and it's an interesting feeling. It's kind of surreal. You still feel like you got a game left in you, and you just got to face the fact that it's not going to be wearing the silver and blue at Nevada anymore. That it's whatever team that I play for at the next level. And so, it's a little sad knowing that, my college career is over, but I don't have any regrets about it, so I'm just looking forward to the next thing.
Well, of course, the NFL draft is now less than 2 months away. Can you just tell us where you're at as of right now? I mean, where you're training at, and when and where your pro day will be at, stuff like that?
Yeah, I'm out right now. I'm in Phoenix, Arizona, training out at Exos. It's a great facility, some of the best trainers in the world. And so my pro day is March 25th. So I'll be heading back to Reno here in about 2 weeks, just so I can get, acclimated to the altitude and make sure everything's good to go there. And like I said, man, I'm just excited to go for it.
Yeah, absolutely. That definitely sounds great. Final question for you, Brock. Everybody wants to know, are you going to be bringing the mullet along to the NFL with you?
I'm going to be bringing it with me, but I can't promise it's going to stay, man. I've heard stories about training camp and, what the veterans do to the rookies' hair. So, if it stays, it stays. If it doesn't, it doesn't. It's just one of those things. I'm just here to play football.
Hey, sounds great. Got to wait and see. Well, Brock, that's all I have for you, man. I really do appreciate your time. It's been a pleasure watching you at Nevada, and I'm certainly wishing you nothing but the best throughout this process. Do you have anything else for us before I let you go?
No, man, like I said, just thank you for having me. Appreciate it, and, I wish you the best.
Absolutely. Thanks again, and take care, Brock.
You too, man.